So today is the 2nd of February in 2021. Many Christians at the beginning of the year in January, they start a new Bible plan, a new Bible reading plan. And probably like many, we don't want it just to be perfunctory. We want it to be useful. One of the things that I like to do is I like to try to bring down what I've been reading into kind of a digestible format. So whether that's just what I've read that day, or maybe summarising a whole book at the end. It's one of the things I like to do. So I thought I'd share that with you today. And what I did that for is the book of Genesis. So that's the book probably most of us began with on the 1st of January. And so I did it for Genesis. And here's 7 points that I have that helps me to remember the key themes of the book of Genesis. So first, we see the preeminence of God. The opening words of the book lead us right in that direction as we see, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He is the first. He is the Alpha. He is the foremost. He always was, always is, and always will be. Secondly, we see the problem of sin. In the 3rd chapter, we see that the deceiver tricks God's people into turning away from his good will and word for their lives, seeking their own benefits, their own good. And so the outcome of that is that the people are cast out of the garden. And what that means is that they are cast out of the presence of God. And the rest of the Bible is all about how do people who are now stained by sin come back into the presence of God. But it's actually in that same chapter that we come to the 3rd point, which is the provenance of the gospel hope. Provenance is a word that's quite prominent in the art world. In the art world, you want to know the beginning point of an artwork and how it came to be in the hands of those who now have it. And the provenance of the gospel hope in the New Testament is all about how Jesus fulfills the Old Testament hopes. In the very beginning is Genesis chapter 3. After the announcement that God is going to cast Adam and Eve, God's people, out of his presence, he gives them a hope. He says that one who was born to Eve, one of her offspring, or literally seed, he will crush the head of the deceiver, of Satan himself. And so there is the very beginning of God's gospel hope for his people. Fourthly, we see the preservation of that seed that saves. Now, probably one of the first tests for you as you're making your way through the book of Genesis is reading those genealogies. Oh, they're hard work, aren't they? There's some riveting narrative as we work our way through the book, but then it's punctuated by these long lists of names. And honestly, they can seem quite boring. Yet they're integral for the book, because as we've seen, there is this gospel hope, which is the son who would crush the head of the deceiver. And here, throughout the book of Genesis, we see the line that is maintained as we look forward to that son sometime in the future who would come to defeat the enemy and bring God's people back into his presence. And so throughout we see the preservation of the seed that saves. Fifthly, we see the promises of the covenant. So God enters into a special relationship with his people. That's what a covenant is. It's not merely a legal contract, and it's not a relationship that can be left easily. It is a special relationship, like a marriage, where promises are made between one party and another. And right at the beginning, we see these promises that God makes to his people. Promises of giving them a new home, of creating this large and great family and of being a blessing to the whole world. God sharpens that final one where he says the blessing to the whole world will come through that seed that saves. Sixthly, we see the priority of worship. So one of the first times we see the explicit use of worship language in the book of Genesis is actually the time with Abraham when he goes to sacrifice Isaac. And so one of the things we see is that worship is costly because God alone is worthy of all of our obedience, of the totality of our love and concern. And finally, the seventh point is the providential rule of God. The book of Genesis ends with the story of Joseph. You might know him, Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. He gets sold into slavery by his brothers who are envious of him. But by the end of the book, the brothers come to him when he is the equivalent of the Prime Minister of Egypt. And he saves them. He gives them food when they were suffering in famine in their own land. And he says this line to them. He says to them, "You meant evil, but God meant it for good, to save many people." So God providentially rules. Providential means that God is over and above, and he works all things for his glory and for the good of his people. So there you go. There's 7 points. Maybe it'll be helpful for you as you read through the book of Genesis. Maybe it's a practice that you might want to take on. How could you summarize the book that you've just read? So let me finish. What are the 7 points that I got from Genesis, working through it over this last month? The preeminence of God, the problem of sin, the provenance of the gospel hope, the preservation of the seed that saves, the promises of the covenant, the priority of worship, and the providential rule of God.